everybody, Mr. Johnson here, and we're going to talk about using watercolor techniques for practicing different watercolor skills. So we need to have our paper ready, paintbrush, set of watercolors, water, and paper towel. I would also recommend having 2 different cups of water. I really like having one dish for dirty water and then a separate one for clean water to use for color mixing. If you don't have 2 separate dishes, you can use just one. Just make sure you're always kind of dumping out the dirty water so it never gets too dark on there. So there are 8 different techniques we are going to practice. A flat wash, a graded wash, a blend, wet on wet, wet on dry, a dry brush, blot, lift off, and drop in. I know, it's a lot. So let's start with the first one, shall we? So this is a flat wash. So now, to begin, we are going to draw a grid of 8 boxes onto our piece of paper. So I'm going to do that for you. Now, I'm doing mine with a Sharpie so that it's nice and bold and easy for you guys to see at home. But you don't have to do that. You can draw it with a pencil, with anything, does not matter. But we want 8 boxes. All right, I think I did a pretty decent job of splitting those up. They don't have to be perfect, right? That doesn't really matter. And I'm a big fan of labeling things, so here we go with our watercolor practice. All right, so this is what we're starting with, right? 8 sections to try 8 different watercolor techniques. Now, we're going to start the first one. And I actually need to get set up here for a minute because the first one's going to require us to tilt up our paper. So this is a flat wash. So again, I'm labeling that box flat wash. That way I'll be able to have this as a reference. And now so I'm folding my book back because I'm going to tilt it. This works best when you can tilt your paper up at about a 45-degree angle. If you're not able to do that, you can try it flat on the table, but it definitely works best when you can take the paper you're using and tilt it on an angle like this. It's about 45 degrees. So I'm going to tilt mine up, my sketchbook here. I'm getting the camera lined up so you can see it. There we go. All right, so I'm going to tilt it so now it's on an angle. And what you want to do with a flat wash is load a good amount of color on your brush and paint this mark. And you see how you've got this bead of paint at the bottom? So that is where the water and the color kind of settle there. If your bead drips down the paper, you have too much water. You don't want that. And what we're doing is using that bead, right, to be the rest of our paint. Instead of dipping this back in the paint pan, we're now moving across with that bead and using that to smooth out the surface. So I'm going back over where that bead is. Oh, it's all about the bead. Right, and now as it drips down here, right, I'm going to use that bead again to spread more of the paint across. That's the idea of a flat wash. And what happens with a flat wash is that that's a way for the color to be as smooth and consistent as possible. Now, if you have a little extra on there, like I have an extra bead of here, I am using a clean brush. All I did was rinse it off and I dried it on my paper towel. And I just kind of touched that onto the extra water there and picked it up. So that's a flat wash. And again, with any of these, you can always pause the video and go back and rewatch anything that you want help with. So technique number 2 is a graded wash. So a graded wash is just a wash that fades from dark to light. And we're going to use some clean water to help that color fade. So you want to mix your color with plenty of water, right? Remember, the water activates the colors. These are dry paints, so you need a good amount of water in there. And now I'm going to just make a bold swatch of color. Now I'm rinsing off the paintbrush in the clean water. Right? I'm going to dab it a little bit so it's not soaking wet. I'm going to brush over the edge of that color and pull that away. So you're making back and forth motions with the brush to pull that color away. So I'm going back and forth, pulling it away. Now overlapping the green, pulling it down into that dry area. And what that's going to do is help that color to fade. Ooh, look how pretty. All right, I'm going to try to get rid of the glare here, kind of like, boom. Okay, that is a graded wash. So you're going to hit your paper with some color and then rinse off your brush, dry it a little bit. You don't want it soaking wet or the color's going to pool everywhere. So I dabbed off a little bit of that extra moisture from the brush, and then using just a clean, damp brush, brushed over the edge of the paint and pulled it away so that you get a graded wash. Again, feel free to go back and rewatch these at any time. If you want to see me do it again, you are welcome to do so. All right, so now technique number 3 is a color blend. Now, blend is basically 2 overlapping graded washes in opposite directions. What this means is instead of having one color and fading it to white, we're going to fade one color into another color. So you have to do this pretty quickly while both colors are wet. If one starts to dry, it's not going to work. So you see here, I'm starting with blue. I'm going to do a big, blob of blue color on there. Again, this is just for practice. And I'm quickly going to rinse off my brush and use some green. Now I'm rinsing that off in the dirty water, then touching it into the clean water. And now I'm using just a wet brush to go back and forth over both areas of color, right? It's going into the blue, into the area in between, and now into the green. And that is going to how both colors blend in the center. Now, we're not mixing the colors completely. You want it to still be color 1 on the left and color 2 on the right. But in between them, we get a nice blend. So that's what we're looking for. One color, another color, and then the space in between them, we use just a clean brush, rinse it off, and then combine both of those colors. And hopefully it kind of fades, right? We don't have a harsh line here and a harsh line here. It's what we're looking for. If you get that, it means you probably waited a little bit too long and it started to dry. Okay, technique number 4 is wet on wet. This is a classic watercolor technique where you wet the paper first and then apply the paint. And what this does is it allows the edges of the paint to spread and soften. It's a great way to create things like sky, where you want, soft blended colors. It's really pretty. So first I'm just applying a little bit of water to the surface. And now when I add my paint to it, the paint is going to spread into where you've put the water. Now, this also depends on how much water you've included. The more water there is, the farther the paint will spread, but it also may pool, right? The less water you have, the less it spreads. And you can also do this with a color in the background. So now I'm going to apply some yellow paint and make sure it's got a good amount of water in there. And then I'm going to very quickly rinse off my brush and apply some green color right on top of this. And you'll see that green color, as it sits, is going to start spreading out. I'm actually going to jump in here. I'm blotting off a little bit of extra color. I'm just picking up some off of the wet area. But you see how that green is really spreading out? Right, that's what happens to wet on wet. You get these soft edges. It's a really beautiful technique, but as the artist, you don't have a lot of control as to where your paint goes. So if you're a control freak, wet on wet may not be the technique for you. Instead, you might want to try wet on dry. Now you might think, well, wet paint on dry paper, isn't that everything that we do? And I mean, pretty much yes. But this, from my practice right here, is all about adjusting your brush pressure to create strokes of different sizes. So you want to load a good amount of color onto your brush. So I'm going to wet the brush with water. I'm going to really activate that color, right? Really swash that around, get a good amount of color on that brush. Getting a good amount of color on here. And then I'm going to adjust the amount of pressure on my brush to create wider strokes and narrower strokes. So by pressing harder, it flattens out the bristles and you get bigger strokes. By softly pressing, barely pressing on the surface, you get much thinner strokes. So this is all about, can you control the lines that you make with your brush, right? And now I've created a bunch of these, very different sized marks with my brush. How cool is that? Right? That's the wet on dry technique about adjusting the brush pressure. So now for a very textural technique, we're going to try dry brush. And again, feel free to pause these videos at any point so you can go back in and practice them. Dry brush is a wonderful technique for creating textures, rough surfaces, things like an old brick wall or a wooden fence or tree bark. So dry brush is where we load our paint onto the brush. So I'm going to get my brush here full of green. And then I'm going to remove most of the paint. So I'm going to blot off most of the paint. And then when I now apply this color to the paper, it's going to skip a lot. We're going to see a lot of white paper through it because I've removed a lot of the color. So this is a great technique, again, for creating textures. It works really well for that. Now I'm going to do another color on top of this. Dry brush works really well also if you paint a color first and let it dry completely, and then dry brush on top of it. So here we have the dry brush technique. Again, textural element. You're going to see a lot of white paper through it. It's going to be broken, not very fluid lines, but it is great as a textural element. All right. Technique number 7 is called blotting or liftoff. You can call it either one you want. Blot because that's what we are physically doing to the color, but lift off because we are lifting color off of the paper. This requires a piece of paper towel to use. So the first thing that we need to do is just layer on some color. So again, I'm loading up a good amount of color onto my brush, laying that in here. And then once I've laid down some color, I'm going to tear off a little piece of paper towel and crumple it up and then press that onto the surface. And it's going to remove or lift off some of the color wherever you've pressed it right down into your paint. Now, you can create different effects by using smaller or larger pieces of paper towel, or by crumpling it up to be more textured or less textured. This is great for creating patterns and things like fabric. It's also a really cool technique to use for creating foliage in trees, but try the blot or lift off technique using just a little piece of paper towel to remove some color. And now the 8th technique is drop in. This is similar to wet on wet, but this ends up with kind of a tie-dye look where we are going to wet our surface and then just dot in some little bits of color. We're not painting it solid, we're just dotting it in. So first I'm going to take just some water. You'll see me just with the clean water. This is why I like to keep 1 cup for dirty water and 1 cup for clean water, because now the water's clean. I'm just going to dot, boop. Oh, look at cool. Isn't it like, it looks like a cell or something, or amoeba, like you're looking at it under a microscope. And watch, the color will spread and fade. Now, also like wet on wet, you can do this with a colorful surface. So now I'm going to apply some yellow paint. And again, while it's still wet, you have to do it quickly. I'm going to quickly rinse this off and get the green and just apply some marks here. And we will watch that as the paint settles, it continues to spread. So even on the left, it's continuing to spread more and more. You can see how the edges of this fade out. It does create like a tie-dye effect. So that is the drop-in technique. Now, I have a bonus technique for you, and it's using some table salt. So if you have never done this before, our little bonus technique is to just grab a salt shaker. You don't need a lot. You want just a little bit of salt, just a little sprinkle of it. You don't want to dump salt on there. But salt absorbs moisture. It's why we salt roads after it snows, right, to remove ice. So when you apply salt to watercolor, it absorbs the extra moisture and creates a speckled surface. So I will show you what it looks like, and then you have to let it dry before you can remove the salt. So then I will show you in my sketchbook my finished version. So here, I'm just applying some paint. Again, while the paint is wet, I'm going to take my salt and just sprinkle a little bit on the surface. Not a lot, just a little bit. But look at how quickly you can see all these little dots on here. That is where the individual pieces of salt are absorbing moisture from around them. It's really fun. And then here, I'll show you up to the camera. This is the dry salt texture. And see how speckly it is with this light and dark speckles? That is what it looks like. So if you're painting a beach scene right? And you're painting the sand, salt texture is a great way to go for that. Even a galaxy could be really cool using the salt texture. So those are all 8 of the watercolor techniques plus the bonus technique. And when we are done, we should end up with a page like this. Look at all 8 of those techniques right there. Then I've got my bonus salt technique at the bottom if you want to try that. And we are adding these to the digital portfolio for my class. So thank you so much for checking them out. If you have questions, please let me know. And happy watercoloring.